All right, so I wrote a little bit. I want to see in your guys' comments if you would rather me write it all out first and then go over it after I've written it out, than as opposed to like think about it and go through my whole process while I'm recording it. I know I waited for a couple of essays in to talk about this, but um, I definitely want to be of most help. So I'm gonna try different, a little bit different processes in terms of going over transition sentences. There are some essays that I wrote where I wrote every single transition sentence before I wrote the essay. So as part of my outline, I made sure I had the transition sentences written. So here, where I say, and that was most of them, I believe. So if I open this up, so here's the opening, the intro. And then the first paragraph, right from the poem's opening, it's, doesn't need to be a transition sentence as much. Because it's not like from a body to a body paragraph. It's intro to body. So I think that chronology is fine. And I think almost all educators who I had grading my essays, I think only one or two out of over a dozen, maybe even two dozen. I'd say at least a dozen. Maybe probably closer to 2 dozen. Um, Maybe one or two like would comment on like, oh, every single paragraph has to have a transition sentence. I think if you do everything else really well, I don't think it's as big of a deal. Um, if once in a while, you don't you say something like later in the poem, like if you're really deft at writing a good essay and you catch almost every single time, I think that's a little bit nitpicky, but you still want to mostly use um, transition sentences, which basically it's a hook, right? You hook the earlier argument from the earlier paragraph to the next argument. So here, Pope not only uses a 10-to-1 ratio early in the poem to show his greater disregard for unworthy critics and unworthy poets, which is what we talk about here, but later he also speaks ill of most critics in general, stating in lines 19 and 20. So then we're also going to comment, we're also going to talk about he's speaking ill of most critics in general. And then here's where he talks about them, and then we jump right into that argument. And then here we do it again. So although Pope harshly censures below average critics, literary critics in part 1, right, which is what we talk about here, and we actually talk about here as well. So this is kind of talking about the earlier two body paragraphs. He nevertheless elects to spend some time in part 2 offering guidance to help each critic become better. These are just sentence structures. You want to use different, you want to use while and although and despite the fact that blank. I don't normally use despite the fact that. I normally use although, while, nevertheless, however, which we'll go over that, a lot of this stuff. And then I'll have separate videos where I go over specific phrases and when to use them, etc., and when not to use them. But so right here, nevertheless, Alexis spends some time in part 2 offering guidance to help each critic become better. Here, Bob essentially is saying that a critic or judge, right? We're quoting that exact words. We're using quotes. Can become perfect, right? By simply reading, and here we quote the word read. But since we're adding ing, making sure it flows with our sentence, we're putting it in brackets, the ing part of the word. Reading each poem/book in the same spirit, right? Exact same that the author wrote the original poem or book in. While Pope is clearly giving guidance to critics in order to help them become better, help them improve at their jobs. But jobs implies there's multiple jobs, which is a little bit confusing. I like become better. It's a bit of alliteration, right? Giving guidance, become better. I don't know. I like throwing little flourishes, little winks at the reader. It's not like we're writing like a creative piece, but I still like to do that once in a while. I still try to have fun with words. This is all about painting with words. I mean, so even though it's formal, you know, if you can use a little bit of alliteration while writing a really good, clear phrase, I don't think it can hurt. If you go overboard, where the poetic nature of your words, is way more important than the clarity, or way more important than defending your thesis, then I think that's a big, big mistake. But to try to try not to use alliteration, I think is also a mistake. Um, it's just, I don't know. I just feel like it adds, to the poem, or to the essay. Obviously, the most important things. I think I talked about it before in earlier videos, that it's all about clarity. But I think clarity, and perhaps yeah, number one are clarity and defending the thesis. So here, remember our thesis, right? Our thesis is, although we share specific guidance on how one might become a great literary critic. Well, that's what we're talking about here. So he's offering the guidance. So this quote is talking about that part of the thesis. We have a two-part for our thesis. We wanted it to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more uh, like nuanced. You don't want to like let your thesis be so nuanced that there's so much to defend and it just breaks. And it's just, and I think a lot of it's just practice and asking questions, right? Ask your teacher, is this a good thesis? Ask other students in your class. You just ask around. Just really try to use the soft skills, the negotiation skills, the question asking skills. Um, it can be very helpful in terms of improving your grade in English. It's it usually can hurt. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think the more you write, and obviously the more you read, but the more you write, the more you read, you're gonna get better. So, but yeah, I think that thesis works. As a matter of fact, to go back to this, if we said Pope deploys, I think this is a good thesis. Pope deploys Roman word choice in order to malign bad critics much more harshly than does bad writers in parts 1 and 2 of his essay on criticism. Solid. But adding this dimension, and knowing that we've got a bunch of quotes that defend that as well, but that they also connect to have him supporting the author, I think that actually adds a dimension to our thesis that is a bit of a risk, right? Because we're taking a shot, but I think it just adds a little bit more nuance, and I think it might work even better than if we hadn't included it. It doesn't mean that if we deleted that our thesis would be less than. But I do think that if we pull this off, that I think it'll be an even stronger essay if we can pull this off, because there are two parts to this thesis. He shares specific guidelines, but he also maligns bad critics more harshly than bad writers in parts 1 and 2 by using rhyme and word choice. So there are a couple points, and I think we're doing a good job going over it. Pope essentially is saying that a critic or judge can be perfect by simply reading each poem/book in the same spirit that the author wrote the original poem or book in. Now, this is a dangling participle. I know some people will say, and I'm sure I'm going to get, comments and people, there are probably a lot of educators out there who understand and agree that one little dangling participle in an otherwise well-written essay or book or editorial, or movie review or whatever is not a big deal. And I tend to agree. I think that, if you constantly put dangling participles in your writing, it shows a bit of laziness and sort of weakness in your writing. But if once in a while you throw one in there, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think there are certain things that are just massive mistakes. Massive. Like defending points, multiple points in an essay that don't defend your thesis. That's a massive mistake. But I don't think a dangling participle, 1 or 2 or even maybe 3, spread out over a 7-8 page paper is the end of the world, or should be dramatically marked down because, just for that. I think that if you follow everything else, if you do everything else pretty well, but those are your minor quote unquote flaws, I don't think that that's a big deal. Um, so yeah, so the author wrote the original poem or book in. I guess you could say in which the author wrote the original poem or book. Um, in the same spirit, in which, but I say in the same spirit, and then in which, it just, I don't know, I think it flows a little bit better here. I'm gonna leave it. I'm gonna leave it. It's a bit of a risk, but I'm gonna leave it, and hopefully most educators wouldn't mind. I don't remember getting a lot of grief if I had one or two dangling participles in an otherwise well-written essay. While Pope is clearly giving guidance to critics in order to help them become better, he is still referring to them merely in reference to the author, and basically tells them he is still referred. So let's actually move this backwards. It actually sounds better. He still refers to them and then basically telling them. He still refers to them merely in reference to the author. Yeah, he still refers to them merely in reference to the author, basically telling them to follow the author if you want to become a great critic. Now, it's kind of hard to explain why this sentence makes sense. I'm just not that granular in the sense of like knowing, every little part of speech and this participle and that participle. Like I'm pretty good at it, but I think I learned a lot more with regards to paying attention in class, doing all the exercises, all that stuff from even when I was young, but also just reading a lot. Like I cannot stress this enough. And you know what? Learning English, um, and all the participle and the present participle and the past participle, it's tough. It's really tough. So I have a lot of respect for folks that learn it from scratch, that learn different languages, 2, 3, 4 languages. So much respect. But as a first language learner, I think that I learned more from, and I didn't remember like every little, word, like this is a gerund and this is this and this is that. Like I'm good at it, but I'm not like amazing at it. But I am pretty solid at writing decently because I read a lot. So I think a lot of it is just like your memory. Like the red flags are going to come up if you've read a lot and you're like, oh, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't sound good. I'm saying it out loud. It doesn't sound good. Whereas I might not be able to explain exactly why it doesn't, in terms of the wording, where this present participle is da da da. So while Pope is clearly giving guidance to grace in order to help them become better, he still refers to them really in reference to the author, basically telling them to follow the author if you want to become a great critic. Let's just say, basically tells them. I think it can work, basically telling them. So refers to them, really refers to the other, and if you want to become a great critic. But I think it could still work by saying, basically telling them. But since we don't have a lot of sentences here where we might use this, like still refers and basically tells, or basically telling them, I think this is fine. If we had a lot of sentences that were structured in this way, like if we had another sentence in this paragraph that was structured this way, or in the next paragraph, I would do comma, basically telling them. But it just doesn't make as much sense if I say he is still referring to them and basically tells them. I guess it does make sense, but a lot of it is just how it sounds, and how it looks, but how it sounds is so crucial, and that's just because of a lot of reading. So like leisurely reading, I think, whatever you like to read, especially when you're young or you're in school, just read a lot. They call it leisure reading. It's supposed to be fun, reading about different worlds, nonfiction, fiction, biography. It's all a lot of these books. they've got publishing. They've been vetted. You know, they've been vetted. So, um, especially yeah. Anyways, all right. So yeah. Let's okay. So then, by doing so, Pope subtly grants authors more deference in these lines as compared to critics. So I'm making the leap that he's still talking about the authors when he's talking about critics. Even though these are the first two lines of the stanza where Pope is offering a recipe for each critic to become perfect. Now let's look over at this. So this whole stanza right here, he's talking about he's talking about he's giving advice, he's giving guidance on how to become a great critic, starting out a perfect judge. So this we're going to use more than one line to defend that, and that's half of our thesis, at least a third of our thesis. So we're talking about that. We're nailing that part of the thesis, defending it, arguing it. So by doing so, right, you want to like make the connections, make the hooks, right? By doing so, here, um, while, although blank, you always want to make the connection, make the leap. So you're sort of using transition sentences between paragraphs, but you're also using sort of transition phrases and words between a lot of these sentences. Um, and you're making all the conclusions. You have to make all the conclusions and make all the points. You can't expect the reader to say, "Oh, okay, cool. Well, you know, the writer just like dropped this. We're totally fine. I get it." No, you gotta introduce. You have to introduce the quote, drop the quote in, and then defend the quote. And you have to have a lot of analysis here after the quote. It's frustrating when a reader reads this and then there's a quote and then there's a little bit on the quote, then you move on. Like it's better to have a little bit the quote and then talk a lot about the quote and just keep going over them. Like pick out words, make 2 points. If you can make 2 points, 2 or 3 points on the same 2 or 3 or 4 lines, like that's solid. It means you're really explicating. And yes, I know it's very hard to read and explicate and interpret poems, but the more you practice, you'll get better and better at it. And hopefully, um, these videos are helpful because you don't have to know what every word or line means to be able to write a good essay. That's like my thesis, right? With these videos, is you don't have to know every single word, because I didn't know every single word in every single book or poem that I read. But if you just sort of follow this recipe, in terms of outlining and picking quotes that you truly understand and all that stuff, then I think you can really perform well and be confident, as you're writing and proofreading. So by doing so, Pope slowly grants authors more deference to these lines against critics. Even though these are the first two lines of the stanza where Pope is offering a recipe for each critic to become perfect, it is perhaps apropos or appropriate. This is a little bit more flowery. It's perhaps apropos that Pope again conveys more respect for authors in general in relation to critics in general. Oh, that's a lot of ins. Um, and I don't even want to say it's in comparison to, because it's another in. So if I want to use in general, I've got to say as compared to critics. So what I might do, you might be thinking the same thing I am, is switch this to in comparison. Or as, well, we said in comparison. You could say, by doing so, Pope subtly grants authors more deference in these lines in comparison to critics. Let's say with these two lines. Does that make sense? How does that sound? By doing so, Pope subtly grants authors more deference with these two lines in comparison to critics. So we could maybe move this phrase somewhere else in the sentence or delete it. But let's say we deleted it. By doing so, Pope subtly grants authors more deference in comparison to critics. I think it works. Let's just delete it. We could say here. In comparison to critics. Here, yeah, I think it goes better. Yeah, by doing so, here Pope subtly grants No, I don't think we need here on this in this one. I think it works. Okay, so let's back up. Here, Pope essentially is saying that a critic or judge, while Pope is clearly giving guidance to critics in order to help them better, so for some merely in reference to the other, and basically doesn't follow that one quick critic. Here, this whole paragraph, we know we're talking about these two lines. By doing so, Pope solely grants others more deference in comparison to critics. Even though these are the first, and then we go back to these first two lines. So even though we spent a couple sentences and didn't use the word here, we used it here. So we don't have to oversell the word here or these two lines. And again, a lot of this, it's really hard to do one video on using the word here a lot. So I think in terms of the format, it's I think sort of just these videos, because it's tricky. It's really tricky. I think a lot of it is just the feel. We don't need that many here's. But it's just, it's just how it feels. So a few sentences without using here, we know we're talking about this specific quote, but then we want to use it, we want to remind them what we're talking about, and then we're talking about that here specifically. Even though these are the first two lines of the stanza, again here, where Pope is offering a recipe for each critic to become perfect, it is perhaps that Pope conveys more respect for authors in general, because, and then here it talks about the thesis, because he is reminding the reader of his overall support of authors. Therefore, and then here, we're making a little bit of a leap. I still think it makes sense. We're not going to do this very often. We're going to be very direct and pick the easiest to argue quotes. But I like that because it's the first two. I think the first two, we can make a few arguments that show, support for our thesis overall, and things around the thesis, but we want to keep bringing it back to the thesis. So we're talking about maligning bad critics. Well, he's not talking about bad critics here. He's talking about how to be perfect. But we can still argue that we're going back towards bad critics. Therefore, he again slightly shows more support of authors than critics. So later, when he goes back to maligning, now we can use the same word, malign. We can use it more than once, but we just don't want to use it over and over and over again. We want to change our wording. When he goes back to maligning bad critics and bad authors alike. So later, when he goes back to maligning bad critics and bad authors alike, we will again see that he is much more negative with regards to bad critics or judges. Let's call them or bad judges as compared to bad authors or poets. This is a bit of a stretch. I think some teachers would be like, aha, it's not very good. It's a bit of a leap, but I didn't want to just grab these two lines and just mention Okay, here he's saying that here's where he gives the support of she's showing specific guidelines on how one might become a great literary critic. I'm always trying to connect to the most important part of the thesis, which is this part. This is sort of an aside. And again, this is a little risky. You know, there's some teachers that would say, no, Mike, delete this and only talk about this. And this is another reason why I think it's very helpful that you can write a first draft. And I'm not even talking about a first outline. I'm talking about a first draft. Um, Teachers love first drafts, and they can really read how well you write or how well you don't write, and they can give you suggestions. Read this book, take a look at this. You know, Strunk and White, the classic text, the elements of style. I mean, I'm gonna have another video where I go over like some really crucial books to read. You know, in high school English or college English, or even college or high school history classes, or women's studies or sociology. Um, you know, these are all important classes because you're going to be doing some right, even philosophy. I mean, there's still structure, and you have to have logic and arguments, and helpful for a lot of different types of classes. But we're taking a risk here, and so maybe if I brought my first draft in, the teacher would have been like, you know what, this is good, I like this, and you could have asked that about that. What do you think about just using this? If I can argue this and this, well, is that stronger than just me arguing this? And that's another reason why I think that it's helpful to get those first drafts written before the essays due, and then have your teacher or your professor, take a good look at it, or someone you respect, another student, a family member, etc., who you respect. But yeah, I think this is a solid paragraph. And let me know in the comments if you would rather have me write the whole paragraph first and then talk about it, or would you rather have me go over it as I'm thinking of the sentence, and I'm sort of writing the paragraph with you along, as you're watching the video run. All right, thank you very much. See you guys next time.